intro. Yeah, once again, I'm Cheyanne Baird. I'm an NLP research scientist at Posh AI, and I'm going to be talking about annotation guideline management for digital and voice bots tonight. Oops. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. Here we go. Okay. So a bit about Posh AI. When I started a couple of years ago, we were a small company. I think we were about 20 to 25 people. We've grown to, I think, over 80 to 100 now. And we're a conversational AI and NLP technology development company. Our main customers are credit unions and community banks. So we build digital and voice concierge services for credit unions and community banks. We try to automate customer questions for simple tasks like checking hours, location, branch location, ATM info, but we also help customers do a lot of complex tasks such as making payments and transfers, checking their balances, checking recent transactions. So we handle all of this for digital and voice at the moment. So a little bit about myself. In undergrad, I studied English literature and cultural studies, but I've been working in this space for quite a long time. I specialized in sentiment analysis, working at a company called SAS, and actually did a lot of annotation there. It was kind of sentiment analysis and social media analytics. I also worked as a language engineering manager at Amazon Alexa. I managed French, Italian, and Spanish language programs. And that involved also a lot of annotation, guideline management, and grammar writing, building out new features. And now I manage annotation at Posh. And I work with a small team of contractors. They are computational linguists and financial domain experts. So they're all full-time, they have full-time jobs, or they are full-time students, and they do this, in their spare time. I'm also the mom of a busy toddler, so that's also happening. And I quickly wanted to kind of start at the beginning as to why we built out an annotation service at Posh. So when I started at Posh, it was a really small group of people. A lot of people were just kind of doing their own annotation work in Google Sheets, sharing links, and a lot of the data would get maybe misplaced, or it was just hard to manage the data in a really efficient way, or share the data in an efficient way. So as we grew as a company, I thought this is a good opportunity to create a process and a service around this, so we can become more efficient and we can hopefully expand. So when I was doing some research, I started looking into Explosion AI. They're the makers of Prodigy and Spacey. And I really liked what Prodigy had to offer. They have a lot of out-of-the-box recipes that you can use to create your own annotation projects. And there's also a really amazing support community online. And that's actually what led to a case study, because I posted so often on the forum that some people at Explosion AI reached out to me and wanted to chat about what we were building at Posh. So one of the things that Prodigy didn't offer was a way for multiple annotators to annotate the same set of data. So we built one in-house. One of the NLP engineers on my team at Posh built an amazing service, then Prodigy was really interested to see how we were using it and how we were using it to support our voice and digital deployments. So the case study is called Deploying a Prodigy Cloud Service for Posh's Financial Chatbots, and it's actually highlighted on my LinkedIn page. If you want to check it out, it kind of gives a more in-depth view as to the annotation service we built. But I will go over just like a general overview of it. There's more in the case study. So basically, I'm the administrator at this point, but we've built a service so that pretty much anybody can go in, create a data set, publish it, and create a task if they want to. So it's available for everybody at Posh to create their own annotation project. And we have 5 annotators. I use a fast API interface to set up the tasks, and the Prodigy interface. I basically build custom recipes, which are Python scripts. So I reuse a lot of tasks or a lot of recipes for tasks, but I will customize them. I might, create custom HTML or JavaScript checkboxes, text fields, anything that we need for a particular task. So we start a separate Prodigy instance per annotation task, and we have a PostgreSQL database and a Cloud SQL instance, and a GCS bucket with recipe configurations and input data. And so I have basically a Git repository for our raw annotated and validated data and all of the associated tasks. And then we have a Git repository for our annotation service that, again, anybody can kind of go and create their own recipe with. So what I wanted to talk about is sort of the other side of this, which is writing guidelines and trying to maintain consistent annotations and labeled data. So how does this all work? So I'm just gonna take this up. So we did set up a pipeline that anybody could kind of follow at Posh, but first I will collect and clean data. So at Posh, we use our own Posh chat logs from voice and digital, depending on the type of task we want to do. And I will use BigQuery to collect that data. And I do a lot of cleaning of the data in JupyterLab. And data can also just come to me from somebody who's requesting it. So sometimes another team at Posh, maybe the analytics team or the product team, will have a data set already, and they just want something done with that data set. So I will then manage and clean it when they give it to me. I will then develop the recipe. So this involves usually a conversation with various stakeholders. So a lot of our projects are internal to our team. We're supporting different experiments, or we're trying to refine a model that we've created or built. But we also get requests from the analytics team, and I'm hoping to expand that so we get requests throughout the company to support a lot of initiatives that we have going on. So I will work with them to kind of go through the requirements, what they're looking to do with the data, what they want to show the annotators, and I'll develop a recipe based on that. Oftentimes I'll have one already that pretty much fits what we need, but sometimes I have to customize a few things. And then I start with writing some guidelines. So I try to kind of come up with, after going over the requirements with various stakeholders who are requesting the task, try to come up with some different scenarios that we want to cover, some common use cases, some tricky cases. And so I create a draft and I basically review that with the stakeholders. And then I will also review it with the annotators who are working on the project, and occasionally 2 people on my team, to kind of get a better view as to, like, does this make sense? Are we covering what we need to cover? And just kind of gather feedback on that. And then I will assign and train annotators. So sometimes the guideline, I'll send out the guidelines and have people read through it. But sometimes tasks might require some additional training. So for instance, Posh has an intent recognition model. that we've just built a new one basically, that's a little bit more fine grained, and it's set up a little bit differently. And so we had a training session to kind of go over the new model for people that were used to the old model and say, here's what's changed. Here's so you're going to see like the top end predictions from this new model, and you know, the naming conventions are different and things like that. So we might have a training session for something that's completely new or experimental. And then I will ask the annotators working on the project. I always have multiple annotators annotating the same set. We'll do an initial sample, like we'll run a little pilot program to see like if the guidelines need to be edited, if we've covered enough cases, and also just check on agreement. So I want to see like, okay, if people are disagreeing, maybe it's pointing something out in the guidelines that doesn't work, or it's not making a lot of sense, or we've completely missed something. And then I also set up a very dedicated Slack channel for each annotation task to answer questions. And the Slack channel includes myself, other annotators working on the project, but also like, for instance, if the task comes from analytics team, I'll add them to the Slack channel because they can weigh in on tricky cases and questions that the annotators have. And after I get like a good chunk of data from both people who have annotated the set, I'll calculate agreement once again and kind of see, okay, how are we doing? Like, are people, you know, is anything not making sense? Did we miss something? So we actually had a project recently where we were looking at chat logs where the end user abandoned the chat. And we wanted to kind of understand a little bit more about these chat logs, like what happened in the rest of the chat log before the abandonment happened. And there was one scenario with an agent escalation where basically if you ask for an agent, but it's after hours, you get a response saying, you know, you'll have to call back during these business hours. And it kind of varies per deployment. And it seemed like a pretty straightforward case, but there were definitely some scenarios that we missed. So there were instances where end users actually didn't ask for an agent, but were getting an agent after hours response. And there were also certain intents that had designed escalation with agent involved, where, you know, if somebody would ask something about a certain topic, it would just immediately go to an agent escalation. And if it was after hours, they would get the after hours response. So we went back and I added these scenarios to the guidelines because all of the diffs between the annotators pretty much pointed to this, this topic. So update the guidelines again. And then once the data is complete, I'll output the annotated data, calculate agreement. It's either myself or somebody else who might review flagged cases and notes. So the annotators can always flag something if it requires further discussion, and they can leave notes in the UI on each document. So it might be myself who looks at them, or if I'm doing a task for the analytics team, they might actually look at the notes and the flagged cases. So they might do that extra validation work. And then I publish the validated data set to a Git repo with a data sheet. So this is a link, and I can probably provide it at the end, but it's a nice paper called Data Sheets for Data Sets. And it was really useful in kind of when you publish a data set, like publishing it with, you know, how the data was collected, all the different labeling and definitions, and it makes it easy for anyone who's going and collecting that data and using it. So a bit more about the customizable recipes. So this is just an example of what a customizable recipe looks like, or just a portion of it. So Prodigy actually has a lot of out-of-the-box recipes for named entity recognition, span categorization, text classification. So it's really great. So you can pretty much use those as a base, and then you can update it with JavaScript, HTML. You can pull in input. So I do that a lot too when I'm running a task where I have to pull the top end predictions from one of our models, and each each document has a different set of options available to the annotator. So we've created some custom recipes around that. And the recipes are all tested locally and then in a development environment before they're actually pushed to prod in our annotation service. And that's just kind of a general overview of what our system looks like, but the case study goes into it a little bit more. So when it comes to writing guidelines, I just thought of I wanted to just share some learnings that I've gathered over time and some lessons I'm still learning and things I'm still working on and goals that I have for the future. I think that like this is, for instance, really tailored for our group, which is a small group of annotators. We have 5 people annotating right now. When you have a larger group, not like all of this might not apply, but we kind of with our core group of experts, I've created a few best practices for this. So I like to share with the annotators like how the data will be used. So for instance, I mentioned our intent recognition model. We also had another task. So we kind of have this model where credit unions can create their own custom intents. And we have a custom intent recognition model, and we were testing that as well. So we have different models that we're testing. And I just sort of like to mention in the guidelines, like this is the goal of we're creating this task and this is how the data from this task is going to be used. So for instance, we have a supervised classification machine learning model. And our intent recognition model, for instance, has some coverage gaps. It doesn't always address every end user problem and requests, but we've built a new model that actually is a bit more fine-grained and really based on sort of specific end user problems. And so in order to test this model and to train this model, we've definitely been using or creating tasks for annotators. They've labeled high frequency data, low frequency, low scoring data. We have a lot of different experiments going to sort of validate our model, to recalibrate, and it's been really useful. So I like to just kind of let the annotators know, okay, this is one example of like how your data is going to be used, and it's to refine this model. Another area I like to cover, again, with this, because we have a small group of annotators, is their impact on the organization. So we have this initiative at Posh called Helpful Banking Moments. And it's a logistic regression model, and it's been developed by our analytics team at Posh. They created a Helpful Banking Moments metric, and it's actually influencing our pricing model as well. So it has a lot of high visibility within the company, and it's just a really important initiative that we're working on. So the annotation exercise, so we've done multiple for Helpful Banking Moments data. It provides the analytics team with a ground truth data set for what's helpful or not helpful, and it helps us to refine our model and our metrics. And the annotators, I think what's really great is that they contribute really valuable insights as domain experts and linguists. So we have multiple annotators who work at credit unions, and they really provide us with a lot of valuable insights into what has been helpful, what has been unhelpful. We also have a class called Neutral. For instance, if somebody just comes in and asks for an agent immediately, we will call that neutral because we haven't really had a chance to be helpful or not helpful at that point. You know, I've let the annotators know, like, this is why we're using this data. And they've done deep dives even into that data to look at instances where chats have been abandoned or where intents have been repeated throughout the chat log, and kind of trying to see like, well, why were the intents repeated? Why did people have to hit the login flow multiple times? Like, is there an issue here? So they do deep dives and they're very familiar with the data at this point and the logs. And recently we had a summit between the analysts working on this and the annotators and some of the team members from the AI team, just to get a better understanding, because everyone was like very deep in the data and looking at it, but in different ways. So we got a lot of really great insights from the annotators about some of the things our model does really well and some of the things that it could definitely, like where we could improve. So that has been really helpful. I also like to kind of share the process of how the task was created and provide any additional resources that might be useful to the annotators. So this also, like if you have a larger group, this would also potentially just go in the data sheet at the end after you've published a data set. But I go over kind of like just data collection methods. For instance, it's really useful for our annotators to know if the task is just covering only voice or voice and digital, because voice, for instance, might have speech to text errors that they have to decode and detect that digital will not have. And so it's good for them to know some of these details. I also, like we've built a lot of in-house tools for the annotators, which have been really helpful, again, with the help of the NLP engineers on our team. But to avoid the annotators having to look at large spreadsheets or wikis or documents, we created just kind of search tools. So for instance, for our intent recognition model tasks, we have a search tool where they can search our intent corpus for, you know, they can use keywords, they can use regex, they can use complicated queries to look up similar utterances or strings to see what else is covered in our intent recognition model, instead of kind of going through a long list of examples or a spreadsheet or documentation. So we definitely try to provide them with easy search tools so they don't have to mine through a lot of documents. And then, you know, there are times when we've done projects that have more to them, such as we did a project recently with GPT, at the time GPT-3, where we generated some text and we were validating some of that text. And while a lot of us in the industry hear about ChatGPT and GPT 3.5, 4 all the time, and large language models, you know, not everyone on the annotation team has or knew as much about it. So I just provide very optional, because it's not required for the annotation task, but optional information about what is ChatGPT, like, and why did we use it. So I just provide any additional information if it's useful, but always make it optional for people. Like if they're interested, they can look into it. And as I mentioned before, I usually have a dedicated Slack channel set up for each task so they can ask questions in real time. And usually only the people that are working on that task are in that channel. So I also like to provide details about the user interface. So even if something seems really simple, or, you know, because, you know, the person, like if I designed it, I think it might be intuitive, maybe it isn't. And I also try to get feedback from the annotators if something is not intuitive or is hard to navigate on the site. Like one thing I try to avoid, for instance, is having drop downs with really long lists or having too many options on the page. But also like things like if it's a multiple choice task or an exclusive choice task where you can only choose one thing. And like this, for instance, this SCT error task where you can label spans. When you hover over the span, a little X shows up, and that's where you can kind of like change your answer, especially if you know, accidentally highlighted a span and you want to change it. So just very basic things like that. I will let people know like how to do that in the user interface, provide visuals, describe additional features like that I've added, checkboxes, write-in options, flagging, and just provide anything like that so they know. Links. So I sometimes will provide links that might be useful so they don't have to go searching for it elsewhere. And I think one of the biggest things is FAQs and just tricky cases. So, you know, we do a lot of complex annotation tasks, and there are definitely tricky cases that are involved with all of those tasks. So I will provide actual examples from our logs if I can find them. And then even if I think of a scenario that might occur, but I don't have an example, I will provide that as well. But I usually try to have a log that they can click on and see exactly what that looks like and a visual. I try to generalize the tricky cases so that annotators can kind of use this general knowledge as a blueprint for similar cases. But they can always also flag them and leave notes. So if they do provide an answer, but they're not quite sure about it, they can leave a note and they can flag it for further discussion, and they can post in the Slack channel as well and get feedback from the team. And I also try to document any like obvious design choices that we've made around ambiguous cases and update as we go if tricky cases show up. But some of the content can be really subjective and really requires context. So when I'm thinking of something like, we did a task recently to look at speech to text errors and an experimental model that was built by the AI team to basically predict possible speech to text errors in voice data and voice logs. But some of them can be really, really strange and really hard to decode. Some of them are really very easy to decode. Like for instance, a very common one for us is chicken is checking, or something like sage is saves. So there's some that are kind of intuitive and easy to spot, and some are not. So I actually, like in a case like this, provided a link to the full chat if in case somebody wants to look at the context and looks at like what came before during the chat, to kind of see if they can figure out like what it might be. But also kind of made it clear, like you don't need to click on that every time. It's just kind of choose what you think is best. And then, but if you want more context, you can click on it and kind of get a good idea of like what was happening around that error. And also for just context, for helpful banking moments, for instance, annotators will read like a full chat log to kind of summarize the entire chat as helpful or not helpful. So we try to provide that information to them. So there have been a lot of lessons learned through this process, and I'm still learning things and changing things, as this is kind of a new service at Posh that we've created. So it's been it's an iterative process. So I just want to share a few things with you. So there are times when, you know, I'll see that there's low agreement on a task, and I'll go in and try to figure out, okay, what's going on. So we had a task recently where we were looking at unhelpful banking moments, and when, you know, so a chat log where it ended up being not very helpful to the end user. And we wanted to see like, we were looking specifically at chat logs where intents were repeated multiple times throughout the chat. Sometimes it's fully reasonable. So a balance, for instance, if the balance intent was hit multiple times, a user might be just trying to get balance for multiple different accounts. But if a login, for instance, is hit multiple times, that is probably signals that there's something going on. There's a login failure, or there could be an account match failure. So, we're trying to decode this, but for this, I think I put too many options up, and I learned that I think there could be a bit of fatigue of reading through the chat, looking at all the different options, and some of the options were similar. So I think I had repeat and rephrase as two separate options. They are different, but they also overlap in some ways. So I kind of took that as a learning experience and thought, how can I simplify that the next time? So we just break it down more, and it's very easy to annotate it quickly without having too many options to sift through. So I think tracking agreement is really useful throughout, because then you can go and you can kind of see if it's pointing to a very specific problem with the guidelines, or with some kind of understanding of the guidelines. So when I looked at that, it kind of pointed to that. And also with the one I mentioned earlier with the agent after hours response, that was after an initial review of the data, but the diffs were all occurring on these scenarios with agent escalation. So it's very good at pointing out what's going wrong. Definitely running a pilot program to address ambiguity and issues early on, doing an initial review with the annotators has been really helpful. When I started at Posh, we had, or when I started working on the annotation service, we only had one annotator. So it was pretty difficult to do any of this. So we've been adding processes as we get more support and more annotators. But now it's great because I can kind of go in and check and review and see how everyone's doing. And I'll often kind of check with the stakeholders too, who requested it, to make sure we're on track and that we're doing what we need to do. I kind of mentioned this in the first bullet point, but really breaking up the tasks to avoid annotator fatigue, to avoid having a lot of diffs, having a long validation process, I think is key. Just simplifying it and breaking it down. You can have multiple data sets. You can break it up into subtasks. And this is something I've learned along the way, is let's try to simplify as much as possible. Understanding how the data will be used, I think, is also really important. So just kind of like we did, for instance, a task around account matching, where we were looking and trying to see how well we were understanding the different account names that end users were giving us in the chat. And I think we had given the annotators, again, maybe too much information. We should have probably just given them one piece of what we gave them, the whole utterance and the account that was matched, and maybe one more thing. And really in the end, I think we only needed one or two pieces of that. So I think that was when I also really thought, okay, we need a data sheet, we need a requirements step. So at that point, it was one of our first projects. We didn't really have a step where we went over data collection and requirements. So I added that to make sure that everyone's on the same page as to how we're using this data, what information do the annotators need to see, what is not important for this task. So I think that has been really key. Real-time feedback, really important for annotators. Again, they work full-time jobs, they're full-time students, they have families. So it is really important, because they are posting sometimes off hours or on weekends, for them to be able to flag tricky cases. So this is an ongoing process that I'm actually trying to refine right now. We have a Slack channel where people can post questions and tricky cases that they've come across in the data. And then we kind of have to assess that as a group and update the guidelines, and everyone sees it, it's visible to everybody. But one thing that Prodigy doesn't have right now as a feature is a skip functionality, where you can skip a task and then you maybe send it to the end of the queue, so it comes back to you at the end after some of these questions have been answered. So right now I'm looking at a way to kind of mimic that, and basically flag and remove the documents possibly and put them into a separate subtask. And so maybe annotating them or not. So this is a process that I'm kind of working on right now to think about how we can deal with tricky cases and updates to the guidelines faster, where everybody gets the information quickly. And a couple of things I learned working at Alexa. So Alexa was very different than Posh. At Posh, we have one domain. It's the financial domain. And we don't, at this point, we cover English and we cover Spanish. But at Alexa, when I was working there, we had multiple domains. So books, we had books, home automation, notifications, music. So many different domains to cover. And there was a lot of ambiguity that would exist between different domains and different features. And so our guidelines always included a lot of design choices, like very clear design choices about where certain utterances would fall based on this ambiguity. And so that became really important. And it was also very important because we were covering multiple languages. So there were ambiguities that existed in some languages that didn't exist in English. And so it was very important to document those for the annotators. And at Alexa, we had kind of a core team of annotators that would we would kind of try to break everything. So we would create a new feature, we'd create a semantic labeling schema, and we'd create guidelines, and we would annotate, we'd do a test and we'd annotate it, and they would try to break it, and we'd try to see like where the problems existed in our feature design and in our guidelines. And then we would fix those and write the guidelines and kind of send it out to the world, where we had hundreds of annotators working on the task. So it was very important to kind of document those key design decisions that we made and any ambiguous cases. Another thing that came up at Alexa is like, if you're dealing with anything very like functional, so I used to work on a lot of home automation projects. So I remember some difficult instances for like thermostats and volume, because we'd have a lot of language versus function debates sometimes when we were kind of creating these designs and new features. And you also had multiple devices. So you had a speaker, you had a screen, and there are just different ways that people use it. So language versus function became a key issue a lot of the time. So that was really also very important to document if you made clear design decisions around certain utterances for certain domains and intents. And then kind of also going back to the first one, the first bullet point, while you can include a lot of different options, they might not be fully comprehensive, and you probably want to scale it down and give the annotators like the simplest task possible. So I usually do try to provide, if it's applicable, like a none of the above or something like that, and always a flag, so they can flag it and say like, this is ambiguous, or this user is making multiple requests. So this is kind of a different case here. And data sheets are important. So I'm definitely trying to include a data sheet with every data set that I publish. I publish usually in our data sets, Git repo at Posh, a raw data set, an annotated data set, and a validated data set, because sometimes another team will do the validation. And so I'll have them push the final validated set that they used. So just kind of a quick summary of some general best practices that I like to follow. Tell annotators how the data was collected, how it will be used. Again, if you're working kind of like with a core group, if you're outsourcing it to a larger group, you may not include all of that information. Provide annotators with key resources, but that are easy to use, like search tools. And so they don't have to mine through a lot of different documents. But I like to provide additional research and materials if people are interested. So we've had annotators interested in like, what's a large language model? what's ChatGPT, all of these things. And so we will provide that information to them. Explain the user interface with design, user interface design with visuals and examples. And I mentioned tricky cases a lot, but also just common use cases. The annotators actually told me they like to have at least 3 to 4 examples per case. So I think it's important to include information about tricky cases, but also just very common use cases that come up. We like to use clustering to kind of surface common cases and outliers during the initial guideline writing phase. Always do an initial review or pilot to make sure you don't need to, or just because you probably will need to recalibrate your guidelines or even the design of the UI based on that. Get feedback from the annotators. Let them know how it turned out if they're interested. And then this has really been helpful, hold a summit or retrospective, especially for ongoing tasks. So the helpful banking moments task that we did, we did like a retrospective at the end, and we got a lot of really great feedback from the annotators of things that we probably should work on to improve our model, to improve the metric. So that was really, really helpful to just get everyone together and talk about it. So I have a lot of plans for the future, because this is always, I'm always trying to improve our service and what we provide. So I've been experimenting with bootstrapping recipe development and annotation with GPT 3.5, soon 4. This includes, I've tried sort of some experiments with pre-labeled data, like labeling entities, even working with this helpful banking moments metric to see if I can work with GPT-3 to, or GPT 3.5 to kind of understand what's helpful and not helpful in an interaction in voice and in digital. And then also generating data and examples for guidelines. I've tested it with that. And Prodigy actually has some core recipes available that where you can use the OpenAI API. So you can actually go in and like, they have a really great recipe available to do that. Always trying to improve inter-annotator agreement. So making sure that we're like in line with what we're doing, and that we catch things early if something is not clear. Increase speed and efficiency. So right now, I've mentioned several times we have a core group of 5 annotators. It's a really small group, and sometimes we're doing tasks that are highly subjective and they're kind of complex. But we have some other tasks that are simpler, that maybe we're thinking we could outsource this while maintaining a core team of domain experts to annotate complex tasks, to validate the data. But we're experimenting with sort of outsourcing some of the other types of tasks that we have, like for instance, validating the top prediction of some of our intent recognition models is something that is pretty straightforward. Or is this an STT error or not? Is pretty straightforward, even though it can, some financial domain expertise is useful, but it can be learned over time. And I've also kind of, experimented with simplifying guidelines for larger audiences. So not including everything that I included here for the smaller audience. And that's been a good exercise. And then collecting feedback from annotators, doing more retrospectives, getting feedback. So I want to do more of this. So I do ask, I have one-on-ones with people. I do polls sometimes. And, I ask people to look at guidelines. I came up with kind of a new process recently for tricky cases and asked people to look into that. And I just want to do more of that. So I get their feedback because they're really deep in the data and they just know a lot about, what the data looks like. And so always trying to ask them more. Oops. And that's all I have. So thank you so much for listening. And I would love to take any questions that anybody has.
Thank you, Cheyanne, for this impressive talk. There's a lot of pretty detailed and insightful information. That was awesome. So since tonight we're a relatively small group, I suggest please feel free to go ahead, just unmute yourself and ask the questions directly. If you have any issues with audio and or mic, also please feel free to drop the questions in the chat box. I'll read them from there. So yeah, and I think Megan has a question. Megan, would you like to ask it yourself, or should I read it out?
I was curious. Thank you for the great talk. This has been really, really good. I was curious, like, how open was Posh to your ideas? And was everyone on board from the beginning?
Yes, everyone was really on board from the beginning. Actually, I think like Posh as a company is really awesome because you can kind of take an idea and run with it. And if you have people to help you out, it's really, you can just kind of build it. So, you know, I had the help of one of the NLP engineers on my team, and we just built it, and it everyone was very supportive. So I didn't really encounter any issues there. I do think that one area that we could improve is, even though I said anyone can go in and create a data set, customize a recipe, I'm still kind of doing most of that at this point. And I think maybe just some more outreach and education on how to do that would be useful. And also just expanding the fact that this exists to other teams, because I think most of our requests come from the analytics team at this point, but I think other teams like product and CS might benefit from this too.
Another question while I have the floor. Thank you. Will you come back and report out on your experiments, especially with Chat GPT 3.5?
I would love to. Yeah, if Women Who Code Boston wants, I would love to do that. Yeah, just because we've got a lot of stuff on I have a roadmap and I've got so many projects on it. So yeah, definitely.
I would attend. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it'd be super exciting. So let's keep that in mind. All right. Any other questions? Hmm. All right. I don't think I see any questions in the chat box. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here.